Welcome to the first episode of The Wrong Kind of Black. So, what's this podcast going to be all about? It's going to be about my perspective as a black gay male. So, you're probably thinking, why would that perspective be important? Well, I feel as though I've been forced to criticize my own beliefs. I mean, it's probably not a surprise to anyone that the black culture is relatively homophobic compared to other cultures around the world. And then growing up in the West as a black homosexual meant that I had to criticize a lot of the principles in which my own community relied upon. So there's that. And the other side is my identity. It's funny because a close friend of mine realized that I had an identity crisis, or I was going through an identity crisis as a teenager, and I never realized that. I always thought I knew who I was. But he pointed it out and he said, you don't know who you are in the sense of how I identify myself, whether you call it ethnicity, whether you call it race. I think that these are all just labels and social constructions. It was a troublesome time for me, I guess, as a teenager and throughout the majority of my life, trying to find my own identity and ascertain who exactly I am. So to shed light on it, my ethnic makeup is 50% Nigerian coming from my paternal side, 25% Jamaican coming from my maternal side, and 25% English British. Even that, just saying English British, does that mean white? Does that make me white? Does that make me black? Generally speaking, when people perceive me, they just see me as black. And to be honest, I don't have a problem with that. I do identify as a black individual, just culturally speaking. I prefer music that is enjoyed more by people who would identify as black. And I possess many characteristics which a lot of people would deem to be attributable to the black culture. But it's not my entire identity. I grew up around the white side of my family. My Jamaican maternal grandfather passed away when I was 6 years old, which pretty much severed the ties that I had with my Jamaican side. Even though I'm half Nigerian, I don't speak Yoruba. I'm not necessarily perceived as Nigerian to a lot of the Nigerian people that I meet. Well, why? I don't speak Yoruba, which is a predominant language spoken in the country. I've spent most of my life as an atheist. So when I meet Nigerians, not speaking their language and not believing in their God doesn't make me Nigerian enough to even consider it. Even when I went Nigeria, they called me a white boy there, and a lot of people stared at me. There was no way that I could fit in. So yeah, I've never felt like I belong to any particular culture, and there's benefits to that. I think there's a lot of things that you don't ever consider criticizing because you identify as that, and generally speaking, people have pride in the things that make them who they are, particularly when all of the people around you aren't questioning them. But I also think there's shortcomings with identifying with a particular ethnic culture or race or whatever you want to call it. And just as though there's shortcomings with me not being able to identify fully with a particular race or particular social group, there's benefits to not identifying with a particular race or particular social group. And that's what I want to talk about on this podcast. I think there's a lot to be spoken about, and maybe someone can resonate with some of the things that I'm saying and some of the things that I'm questioning and bringing up, because I believe particularly in Western culture, there's a lot of censorship on speech, which I find somewhat ridiculous and funny at times. And depending on the racial group that you're from, you might feel a little reticent when it comes to expressing your true opinions about a particular race or social group. So, people are generally nervous about talking about homosexuals or anyone in that community. And it's great because I'm gay, so people will know that inherently I'm not homophobic or transphobic. And being black means that it's easier for me to criticize aspects of the culture that makes me who I am. So that's, in a nutshell, what my podcast episodes are going to be about. And I've also lived as well, I think I should mention, in a communist regime, China. That also changed my worldview and helped me to understand a lot of fundamental concepts about who I am and what I'm proud to be. So yeah, let me talk about it. So that 25% of British that I derive from on my maternal side, I am proud of. I grew up in the UK, which is predominated by white Europeans, and a lot of people talk about, well, particularly from my community in the West, they talk about white people with some level of animosity and disdain, which I do take offense to at times. But on the other side, there are a lot of very ignorant views held towards the black community, which is obviously something that I completely resonate with. But, you know, it'd be nice to have an open conversation about the aspects of both races or cultures or social groups that ought to be criticized. Why? In the pursuit to make it better. There are things that we can learn from all races and ethnicities and social groups around the world. And again, that's the kind of stuff that I want to talk about and address on this podcast. So for the first episode, I thought it'd be necessary. I mean, when I listen to podcasts, I generally just listen to random episodes that I think I'm interested in. I don't necessarily start from the beginning. So if anyone is following from the beginning, or if anyone is starting from the first episode, perhaps you might want to know what some of my beliefs are before you decide to invest your time in hearing some of the things that I do want to address and talk about. So, my beliefs. I'll start with free speech. I believe in the absolute freedom of speech. What does that mean? It means that, yes, there's a lot of offensive terminology out there, including the N-word. I don't believe that any government should be able to control what anyone says. I mean, it's impossible, right? Which is becoming more possible with AI and the control that governments can have on its populace. But it's ridiculous, the idea to me that someone could be incarcerated for something that they've said. I feel as though a lot of people believe that believing in absolute free speech means that you encourage people to say things that are offensive. Like, there's so many situations where you should not say the N-word, for instance. And I believe that anyone who is educated knows how to manage the speech that they utter. And we don't need a government to tell us what we should. Well, I guess they can encourage us in terms of what we should and shouldn't say, but I don't believe that they should be able to arrest us for something that we've said. As I said, there's a lot of offensive terminology out there. Doesn't mean that the government or the police should get involved. As long as we're having these kinds of conversations where we're thinking critically, then our culture and society is going to evolve into a place where we don't use terminology that offends people. But if someone is ignorant enough to use it, then so be it. Because offense is subjective. Anyone could be offended by anything in theory. So yeah, I just find that ridiculous. I do want to do a podcast episode on that. I've always thought it's somewhat interesting, particularly because people are afraid to talk about it. I don't believe that racism exists. I believe that racism is a social construct. I'll get into that on one episode for sure. You might already tell, but I do have some atypical perspectives on the black community. Again, the black community is often generalized into one community, but there's so many divisions of the black community. We've got Africans, we've got Caribbeans, we've got Latinos, we've got American black people, we've got British or European blacks. There's just so many differences across the religions, cultures, languages, that sometimes I even find it offensive that people just label us all with one word. I see myself as a boring homosexual, and I guess that's what I've extrapolated over the years. Why do I say that? Because the stereotype of a nice gay guy is, or a gay guy that you want around you, is funny, is happy, and again, it's just a stereotype. Expecting someone to be one type of way, or expecting a whole social group to be one type of way, is not the reality. Even though it would be nice if all gay people were happy, but I'm a pretty miserable homosexual, if I'm being honest. On that note, we know very little about sexuality. People seem to be afraid of it, particularly religious people, for good reasons. And again, that's definitely an episode I want to do. Like, why would people have good reasons for not wanting to address sexuality? Well, it's something that we know very little about. It's something that could destroy this familial structure that has been built over thousands of years. The family structure promotes a civilized society. So there's lots of reasons why people might be afraid to have conversations around sexuality. But it is fascinating. I ask myself every day why I am homosexual and how I've managed to stay homosexual and how it completely changes my perspective on the world. Considering most of the actions that we undertake are led by our impulsive desire to climb the social hierarchy so we can mate and so we can procreate. I mean, where does homosexuality fit into all of that? It's interesting. It's very new. I mean, the fact that gay marriage has been legalized in the UK, one of the most progressive countries in the world in my lifetime, means that it's a turning point in history, us collectively accepting, at least in the West, the idea of sexuality. The pendulum might have swung a little too far in terms of all of the genders that people have made up and how young, insecure people have been indoctrinated by far left liberals. I mean, there's lots that need to be spoken about and there's lots that need to be understood about sexuality before we can understand how it fits in society and how we should address sexuality to our children, right? It's all up in the air. So I've recently started to believe in a higher being, even though I spent most of my life as an atheist. Obviously, this is something that's been spoken about for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And since the scientific revolution, it's been heavily criticized and there's been a lot more conversation about whether a higher being could exist. But in recent times, people are starting to become more receptive to the idea that there is a higher being watching over us. I mean, some people can perceive it as something that's somewhat narcissistic, the idea that this supreme being cares about your individual life, considering there's up to 8 billion people on the planet and there's a vast area of the universe that we haven't even explored yet. But there's a lot of universal wisdom that comes behind religion, which is the reason why I've started to believe in the idea that something more could exist. But it's very difficult to believe it with the tenets of the Abrahamic religions because there's a lot of stuff in the religious scripture which has been debunked and which is completely incompatible with a progressive Western society. But I'd like to speak about that in more depth. Other things include, I think that everyone should work out. I think fitness is important. If people don't know or understand that yet, there might be a good reason for it, but perhaps conversations around it might invigorate people to understand the importance of it and start to implement it in their lives. And that goes hand in hand with diet. You know, we're okay here in the UK, but people in America are exposed to food that kills them. There's some evidence that's coming out that makes it viable that a lot of the food that we're eating could be attributable to cancer, which is another thing that we don't have enough knowledge and information around. So maybe people have information around health and fitness and diet that hasn't been externalized and made accessible to the public. I don't believe that white privilege exists in the Western society. I think the obvious reasons are because these societies are predominated by white people. Having lived in a more homogenous society like China, I've noticed that a lot of the things that people consider to be white privilege are just a privilege that people have in a country that is predominated by your race. I think that cultural appropriation isn't a thing. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Maybe I'll chat more about that. I believe that there's only 2 genders. The recent appointment of Trump back in office means that America might be headed a bit more to common sense. I mean, most of the people that I've met agree with that. It's a very small minority who believes that there's more than 2 genders, which I find intriguing because I don't think it takes much critical thought to understand that. But there might be a reason why people would like people to be able to identify as other than what has been the 2 genders since time immemorial. Another belief of mine, which might be pretty controversial, especially in the UK, is this whole idea around anxiety. I think that anxiety is just a side effect of being alive. There's no one person who has completely stable emotions unless there's some monk or something, which I don't even believe they'd be able to achieve. I just think they would have good strategies with stabilizing their mood or emotions. But there's far too many people that I've perceived who are using it as a sword rather than a shield. And I think anxiety should be spoken about more. Perhaps people aren't as anxious as they think. Perhaps people have more control over it than they think. Perhaps they don't have as much control over it as they think, and it should be spoken about more. So those are some of the things that I believe. Obviously, it's a somewhat comprehensive list, but I guess you're going to get the general gist of the kinds of things that I want to talk about on the podcast. I don't think it's too important, this part, but maybe someone might be interested in it. If I were to define myself politically, I would say that I'm a libertarian centrist, if that means anything. In other words, I'd possess both liberal and conservative values. Obviously, it's very difficult for me to be on the far right, being black and being gay, and I guess it's easier for me to be on the far left, but my critical thinking skills have led me away from that, and a lot of the stuff that people on the far left believe in, the arguments that they have for what they believe in can be broken down very quickly as well. And bearing in mind, again, I have to refer to the fact that I've lived in a communist regime, and it gave me a great opportunity to criticize a lot of the values that this society was predicated on. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to be talking about in this podcast. What is the purpose of me wanting to chat about it? Well, I think that there's fundamental truths behind everything around us, and I think it's just our job to dissect our society, our culture, and find the hidden truths. I think there's use to these truths. These truths could be perceived as universal wisdom, and if we had more access to this wisdom, if we spoke about it more, then perhaps we'd be able to use it and apply it to our own lives to increase the quality of our lives, to help us make peace with our lives and our situation. There's a lot of universal truths that I've been exposed to which has helped me to improve the quality of my own life, and it's only been through having these kinds of conversations that have allowed me to access them and to actually receive them and apply them and incorporate them into my own life. Our existence can be perceived as a burden on us. You know, it's not easy, but by addressing them, perhaps we'll get somewhere with them. I've listened to a lot of podcasts in the past whereby I've resonated with random kinds of people, and a lot of the information that I've received has helped me to better understand aspects of my life, right? And that's what I hope to achieve somewhat from this podcast. So if it sounds like something you're into, then hopefully this podcast helps you to understand where I'm going with this and the journey that I'm on. And you should definitely tune in because I'll be uploading episodes as frequently as possible. Yeah, so thanks for tuning in, and hopefully you'll listen to one of my upcoming podcasts, and hopefully it will be as engrossing as I aspire the podcast to be.